Hi guys. I'm assuming most people are going to rewatch the VOD of this because I haven't really advertised much to my followers on Instagram for my costumes and stuff that I'm streaming, but um, I'm mainly doing this as a resource for them to come back and look at for those people that are making the costume. Okay, before I go into the main reason I was streaming this, which was how to use my Spoonflower fabric to make this costume, I'm going to show an embarrassing photo of one of my first costumes. This one, although some people have told me, oh, it's nice, but I actually only had a couple months sewing experience when I made this costume. I think this was 2019. This Aminta costume is from Phantom of the Opera, and it's always been my favorite in the show, in the stage show. And I had made the dressing gown and I had made her masquerade gown, both of which were awful. And I really wanted to wear this to the show. I had never cosplayed and went to go see the show. So this was the costume I did that in. And at the time, it was quite an achievement because, again, only a couple months of sewing experience. But, looking back at how far I've come on that, I hate showing this, but it's good to show, where you came from and where you are now. This was my first Amenta costume, and then I also I had started on a second one that never got finished. And this is not a good quality photo, but this was part of the stomacher, the middle part. Oh, thanks, Jen. Yeah, I still have people that'll be like, and I actually did sell it to someone. I have people that'll be like, oh, it's still beautiful, but just, I'm a perfectionist sometimes. But I'd started working on a second version of this and never got around to finishing it. But I think I still have this piece, and I did a lot of hand beating on it. Anea, who made this replica, let me find a better photo. This was from when we were in Las Vegas for Phantom Las Vegas, and this was her replica. So I did not make this one. It's funny because she's like a foot taller than me, and everyone tried on this dress, her dress, and it just like fit us perfectly. Um, it was, oh, I just loved it. It was like that's my favorite thing that I think I've ever worn. And we did like a little photo shoot at the Venetian there, and that's like one of my favorite photos ever. But that's her replica, and I've always liked that. But she was kind enough to send me. If you look at the back here, uh, her bodice fit me so well that she copied the pattern for me and sent it to me. And all I needed to do was just adjust a little bit in the shoulders because the shoulders were very tall. But that's something that I have a mock up for. I have the adjusted pattern. I've just never actually sat down and made the rest of the costume. But a couple years ago, one of my clients had me make a replica for her. So I did get a chance to actually make the costume right here. This is I'm always showing people my Red Death costume as like the crowning achievement, but this is one of my absolute favorites too. It took way longer than I thought, hundreds and hundreds of hours of embroidery on the embroidery machine. My machine broke. I had to get it fixed. I was on a deadline, so this one was actually. It wasn't rushed at the beginning, but it was starting to get rushed at the end. Like no sleeping, etc. But I did a lot of planning for it. Here's a picture of the embroidery planning. I did like a Photoshop file, and then you put it into the computer, and I had a lot of reference photos there. But the hard thing is, I have a very small hoop. It's like 4 inches by 6 inches. So I literally, for the larger sections here, I literally had to embroider half a scallop at a time, and you had to just line them up perfectly, which was very difficult. Half the embroidery process was just the planning of trying to line that up within the hoop for each scallop. So I did the worst part of that. I will zoom in here. Was definitely the bodice part here. because it changed from small scallops to the larger ones. And you can see it's not 100% absolutely perfect, but I got it as perfect as I could. This is the US version of the costume, which is, all versions are elaborate, but the US version of this one just seems to be a little bit more trickier when you're trying to actually make it, because of that. And I'll go into that when I go into how to use the fabric that I have on Spoonflower. But I'm just waiting in case other people were joining in for that, because that's what I was advertising the stream would be about. I have a picture of my client, Mackenzie, in this one here. I just love how the skirt fans out. There's just yards and yards and yards. It's hard when you see a skirt like this, you think it's only going to take a certain amount, but when you ruffle something, you often need, 3 times the amount, and then you have to gather it. Here's another photo of her. I love that one so much, but this was definitely the best version of the costume I've done, and very tricky, and it was very close to the original on this version. I actually like the color scheme of the UK versions a little bit better for like the stomacher and stuff. This one always has a lot of different colors, but I tried to match it, and I actually found all of this is custom embroidery on the neckline of the bodice. The ribbon here on the sleeve, I think that's an exact copy of the same one that they use in the show. That's another thing with my replica work. I was always trying to find exact things, which are really hard because in Phantom, a lot of times they use vintage materials, so you can't find the exact trim that they used. But once in a while, you'll stumble across it and get lucky. I did find that one, so that always made me excited when I could find the exact one that they used. Okay, so going into the Spoonflower fabric. So on Spoonflower, by the way, sorry this is all in Photoshop, but I could not get the window capture to work. I couldn't get a browser capture to work in OBS, so I'm just doing it the only way it would work, which was a window capture of Photoshop. So on my Spoonflower is a website, if you're not familiar. They have about 20 to 30 different types of fabric. So like cottons, silks, stretchy fabrics, chiffon, denim, twill, fleece. They have all different types. And then artists upload their artwork, and you can get prints printed on there. So this is especially helpful when you're doing costume replicas, because a lot of the stuff you can't find the fabric, or it's just difficult to find or make. So like in the Star Princess costume for Christine, for some people, it's either impossible to airbrush or dip dye it, or they just don't want to. So like I sell that version that you can get on like a silky fabric. Another popular one is the wishing fabric, which is so complex and so specific that you can't find it anywhere. So there's a couple different versions on Spoonflower. I added my versions. I have ombre versions and a couple different colors and everything, but you can find that at Spoonflower. Let me put a link to my profile. I have lots of different fabric. I just put that link in the chat, especially if anyone's rewatching this video and needs that link, you can see it there. So I offer for this particular costume, and someone was just ordering this fabric, so we were going back and forth about how to use it, and costume takes a lot of fabric, and custom printed fabric is not cheap either. So I was trying to explain to her why I made things certain sizes and how much she had to order. And then I decided to just come up with visuals for that. So that's what I'm going to show right now. So this part might get a little, like tedious if anyone's just watching this just for fun and not for this costume. But I'm going to go through it rather quickly. So for those of you that are making this costume or making a similar costume, I did start with like a ruffled underskirt, a netting underskirt, and then I have Oh, thank you, Jen. Yeah, maybe, I guess I don't think, that one costume might help. Even if you're not making this costume, something similar could help another person. So, and this is only just one faction of this costume. Um, using this faux embroidery print for this particular costume, but other things might come up. So over a petticoat or a hoop skirt, or I used netting ruffles, often referred to as, the netting underskirt of doom. Um, and I don't show that here, but over that, you have a base layer. So um, the height, I just had it here for reference, what my clients was, but it's going to depend if you're tall, if you're short, all these measurements are just going to need to be adjusted, but I just had it there just for reference. And you can see it goes all the way around, but there's an opening in the front. So this is what all the ruffles are attached to. And you can use like a plain fabric or also have matching fabric in the Spoonflower shop if you want the exact match. Or use a very similarly colored fabric for that. So it is like a circle skirt almost, but it has that opening in the front. And I try to leave it a little bit flatter in the front and more gathered on the sides and back, because it does have, let me go back to the image. Over here, it does have that like bustled effect. This costume is one of my favorites because it has so many different, so much different, historical costume features in it. So you have the Rococo, where you have a stomacher here in the center, with the bodice coming over it, and you have the engagement sleeves like that. You see that on a lot of like Marie Antoinette costumes, that kind of thing. But then the skirt, where you see all the layers, that's more of a flamenco thing, Spanish. And I often call my printed fabric Spanish scallops, just so it's not as, copyright. But then since Phantom's set in the Victorian era, which has bustles, the big back areas, it also has that area on there too. So there's like 3 different historical designs in here, which I think is just genius. And I just love this costume for that. So, okay, going back to the base layer, there's going to be a lot of stuff up on screen here, but I'll explain it. So Spoonflower just recently changed their preview images to be like, so it's harder to steal for people. And they wanted to make it look more realistic. So let me zoom in on this. But the one thing I was discussing with the customer was she was concerned that like this area was cut off here, and that the scallops were cut off, but it's not. That's just how Spoonflower shows the thing now, which I kind of hate, because at first I thought it was cool to see a realistic view of this fabric, but when people are looking for exactness in this costume, you have to be so exact. Something like that kind of throws people off. So it doesn't properly show that printed edge, but it's there. So you can also look at the, let me scroll down. You can look at the 8-inch swatch preview on Spoonflower, and you'll see that it does go right to the edge there. So, and there's also, Spoonflower has these Roostery, their side company, where they put the product on like sheets and pillows and stuff. This is going to be a real blurry here, but that's another thing you don't want to pay attention to, because it's going to look like it's cut off and stuff. So they kind of dropped the ball on changing that. I can see why they did it, but for things like this, it wasn't a good idea. Or I wish they could at least show you the flat preview that they used to have. So, okay, in my example, I mentioned there's a lot of different, there is a lot of different types of fabric on Spoonflower, and you have like your budget fabrics and cottons, and they might only be 46 inches wide. I always recommend, even though it's more expensive, I always recommend the wider fabrics, because not only are they better quality, but you're getting more fabric, and I think it's a better deal in the long run. So for one of the widest ones, I think it's 56 inches wide if it's not 58 inches, but organic cotton sateen. I also like silky fail, I think you say. That's another wide one, but this one would kind of do well for this costume. Organic cotton sateen. It's like a medium weight. It's more of a cotton, but it has like, thank you for the host, SJ. Um, it's a cotton, but it has this sheen to it where, most cottons are matte, but this one, it kind of prints beautifully with almost a sheen. So it's almost like a mix between a cotton and a silk. And it also, when you're gathering it, it likes to stay, it doesn't drape as well, but that's good for this costume because you kind of want the skirt panels to, flare out. You want them to almost be crisp. I'll go back to this image. If you have a droopy fabric that doesn't have any substance to it, you're going to have to use more techniques to try and fluff up the skirt. So if you have one that's a medium weight that works to, this is made out of silk here. This one was made out of silk and embroidered. So I should say that this is not the actual fabric on Spoonflower, but it's because this is really expensive and takes hundreds of hours to do. So the Spoonflower fabric that I offer is if you don't have an embroidery machine, if you don't have the time, but you can see how like a cotton might work well for that. I would just suggest swatches on Spoonflower are $5. Get a couple swatches of the color you like in, a couple different fabrics. And because this costume takes 10, 15 yards of fabric, so that's a huge investment. And you want to make sure that you get, the right type for the costume, and you're only going to know that when you feel it. So invest, $15 in maybe 3 swatches, and you'll get the perfect fabric. So it'll be worth it in the long run, because even though you might be spending a couple $100s on that Spoonflower fabric, if I had to charge again for this costume, making it out of silk with custom embroidery, this one right here, it would be $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. That's not what I actually charged for it because I didn't know how long it was going to take, but it took hundreds and hundreds of hours. So think of, in terms of labor and all the thread that you would have to use and all the time you save. And that's when this Spoonflower fabric would come in handy. And I also didn't just put a print on there. I actually made it look like the embroidery. So this is zoomed in a little blurry too, but when it's printed on the fabric, I have the lines as if it looked like the machine was embroidering them there. And that helps with the realism of it too. Okay, so next slide. Let's say you got 2 yards of fabric or something. Again, all the measurements here are going to be relative. Everyone's going to need a different amount based on your size, your height, etc. But so this is the large scallops. If you remember, let me go back. I offer a few different varieties of these, and as I go through the slides, you'll understand why. On the costume, the tiers of scallops are all different sizes. So we're going to start with the large scallops, which are at the bottom of the costume. And basically, for this one, you're only going to get 2 rows of the yardage because you need wide rows for this thing. And another customer was telling me, can you shrink them down? Can I get more rows out of this? But it's really not good for that. And you'll see why as we go through the slides. So what you do when you have the 2 rows here, I just scribbled this out because you're not going to be able to use that part, or you could use it for crafts, or you could use it for decoration on a different part of the costume. But you're essentially getting 2 rows here. And then if you are shorter, you might need to make these rows shorter here. So you would trim off a little bit. But you also, right here on the sides, the top edges of the ruffles, you're going to need, a good inch to hem it and then gather it. So remember, keep all that in mind too. You always need more than you think. So I couldn't see anyone going over 24 inches for this layer. So that's why I chose that measurement, but you might need to cut it down an inch or 2. So this is what it looks like when you cut the rows out. And what you would do is, before you cut it, there's something called Fray Check. And it is a liquid that you can apply to fabrics, and it kind of hardens the edge just slightly. It makes it a little bit stiff, but it's almost like a glue that dries. And then when you cut out the edge of the fabric, it stops it from fraying. And there's ways to I actually use this on the silk one too. Anytime you need to cut something out, it's good for that. But the Fray Check, you can make it a little bit softer if you like iron it right before it's almost done drying. Anyhow, you can look that up. I'll put it in the chat just so it's marked there. You can find it at Walmart. You can find it at Joann's. It's only a couple dollars. You might need a couple bottles of it though, because there are a lot of ruffles on this costume. So you're going to need a lot of that liquid to do that. But that's the best way to finish these edges off. I can show a close up. Okay, so you can see here. Since this was embroidered, and also this is just how the real costume looks, I leave a little bit of an edge there because if you cut right up to the thread, that would be bad. So if you're using the printed fabric, do the same thing and it'll mimic that. And you apply it and then you cut out the scallops once it's dry. Okay, so once you've done that, and you would attach all your rows together so you have one big long strip of fabric, you would gather them too, and you can gather them all at once. I would suggest gathering them in sections because sometimes your thread can break and then you're kind of screwed and you have to stitch again and it's annoying. And, so I would say every little section you have, maybe gather those individually. And once you gather them, you would pin the first layer to your base here, and then you would stitch it down. So also the costume has little black layers in between these layers that I did not show. I'll go back to that for reference. Okay, so the US version has the tulle that's gathered in between to kind of give extra fluff to the skirt. But there are other versions that don't have that. I didn't include it in my tutorial just because it's, it would have just been too lengthy. But the other version, Ania's version here that I'm wearing, again, not mine, but a beautiful version. This one had lace on the edges, so it didn't need the extra tulle in between. I think that the US costumes use that extra tulle in between also to define the points of the scallops and make it stand out more on stage because it could kind of all blend together in the stage lights from far away. Okay, so going back to that slide, you might mark things on your skirt. Definitely pin it and put the skirt on a form so you can see, because sometimes when you pin things to a circle skirt, it might not look like it's even. You might have to adjust it up or down in certain areas because the sides might look like they're longer than the front. So pin it perfectly, get it where you want, and then you can stitch that layer on. So for the second layer, you're also going to use the large scallops. You're going to do the exact same thing. But here's where you need the length in the scallops, okay? I'll go back one slide and toggle it back and forth. You want to make sure the scallops there, right here, you want to make sure that they cover that gathered area because you don't want to see that. I actually made that mistake on my first costume. I didn't have enough length here. And it didn't cover the gathers and it just looked kind of sloppy and everything. So that's why I give it, 24 inches there, and you can adjust it as needed, but make sure it's long enough, and then you can cover it there. Okay, so the next tier, that was tier 1 and tier 2. Tier 3, you need to use the medium scallops. So this is another version of my fabric, and it's labeled medium scallops, and on this one you can get 3 rows out of it, so you don't need to buy as much yardage, which is good. You don't need it as lengthy. Again, this was the organic cotton sateen. It's a wider fabric. On the shorter fabrics, you can see, like, if it was just a 45-inch fabric, you're not going to get a full 3rd row. So just spend a little extra, get the wider fabrics, and it'll be better in the long run because you can only purchase on Spoonflower in either swatches, fat quarters, or 1 yard increments. You can't purchase a half yard, unfortunately. So you have to be smart with how much you're purchasing. Okay, so The widest that I thought these rows would need to go was 18 inches. Again, adjust it smaller if you need it. Leave room at the top for your hems. So here's the example, just as before, how we did this. You would, fray check the scallops and cut your rows out, hem it, gather it as before, gather it into one big long strip that's going to go all the way around the skirt. And then when you attach that, once again, pin it. Make sure you like how it looks where it is. Make sure it's covering the seam of the layer below it here. And then stitch it on there good. And for the fourth layer, it's the exact same thing. This version also uses the medium scallops there. So a notion I had before I even made the costume was that all the scallop layers were different, but really if you're making the US version, it's large, large, medium, medium. And there are all different versions. You don't have to follow this. You can do it however you like. Again, going back to my first version here, it was just they were all the same, actually. In Ania's version here, she had lace, so that was similar. In the US version, it's just they get slightly smaller and smaller as you go towards the bodice. So there's all different types of versions. Do whichever one floats your boat. Let me get back to which slide I was on. Okay, so once you have the skirt done too, you're going to want to add a waistband. Often with these costumes, it's good to have a tall waistband, and then you'll have the bodice come down and cover that all. So you don't see the waistband peeking out or anything, but it would be good to make it from the same material. Maybe, even the scrap here in this one, you could make the waistband out of that. So use your scraps, save all your remnants for that. So the next part, which also uses the medium scallops, would be the sleeves, the engagements. And I have a real picture of those here just before I go into that so you can see what they look like. So it's this area, it's like the ruffle, the cuff around the end of the sleeve area here. So I also use the medium scallops for that. Okay, so if you remember the medium fabric that I have here, you can get 3 rows out of this. And this is one time where I can actually tell you a measurement that you might be able to use. As for how tall you want them to be, that's going to be your own preference. But most of the time when I'm doing dressing gowns, when I'm doing any kind of costume that has these engagements and these ruffled sleeves, each sleeve I use about 1.5 yards per sleeve. And then I gather it all down and put it on the end of the sleeve. So that kind of gives you some perspective of how much you need. Instead of being like, I don't know whether I should gather 3 yards or 1 yard. I generally, for these Phantom costumes, I use 1.5 for almost all of the ones that have those sleeves. The wishing gown, the dressing gown, all that. So these sleeves, they actually taper a bit. And before I show that, actually, I want to show a side view. Okay, so if you look at this image right here, you can see they go a lot longer in the back and they're shorter in the front. It's kind of slight, but it is there. So if that's important to you, you have to cut it a certain way. And to cut it that way, it looks like this. Now, you don't want to do the long, you want to make sure these long areas are at the ends because that's where you're going to sew them together. And if you're going to have a seam somewhere, it would be good to have the seam in the back so you can't see it in the front there. So make the seam area where the long things are. And you can fold your fabric in half to do this and cut it perfectly. But essentially, this is the shape of what they're going to look like. And it's 1.5 yards. And you can choose. Also, remember, leave a good amount at the top for your hems. You can always cut things off or, hem them more, but you can't add to the fabric. So, be careful with that. So you would do the same things like you're doing in the skirt. You would fray check the edges, cut them out, hem it, pin it to your sleeve, make sure you like where it's at, and then stitch it down. And then, like I said before, if you have excess fabric, use that for the sleeves. Use that for part of the bodice panels, okay? So you save all your pieces. And I don't know, this is not to scale or anything, so I don't know how much you would be able to get out of that, but you can make use of those areas when you need little pieces. And I think for this one, you probably could get sleeve pieces out of it. Okay, for the bodice, this is where the costume deviates from generally the UK version and the US version. So I'm going to show both because they're so distinct and there's ways you can use it both. Excuse me. So for, let's see, which one did I do first? I think I did the UK first because it's easier. So the UK version, in the center here with the stomacher, there are no ruffles on it. It's just like a straight line, a straight hem. And then they attach the smallest layer of ruffles to the edge of the bodice here. And that's a very easy way to do it. It still looks great and everything. And that's just how they do it over there. USA, way more complicated. Sometimes you'll see a specific panel here with just the embroidered area. Sometimes it's all one piece. But it's literally the edge of the scallops here and the front all go together. So let me show a real picture of that. Okay, so you can see this was probably like the hardest part of the costume. Right in here, the small scallops, and it's hidden a little bit by that decoration there, but here in the side, you can see the small scallops. It goes, let me zoom in. It goes from small and then into medium here, and then like mitered into the medium scallops at the edge of the bodice. So that is like one heck of a thing to try and do. And it's not entirely possible with the Spoonflower fabric, but I'm going to show you how to get around it and still make it look nice. Let me go back to the slide. But first, we're going to do the UK version because it's easier. Again, none of these pieces are to scale. It's just an example. This version is the small scallops on Spoonflower. So again, I have all different types here. And you're going to see I have large, medium, small, and tiny. Ignore the tiny. I also have the matching fabric there. So we're talking about the small version. And you can see I have a big wide space here. And a customer was wondering why that was for. Jen, I'm already wanting to pull my hair out. Yes, I had a limited amount of time to do this, and I thought I had allocated enough time, and instead I spent like 200 hours doing the embroidery and then had to rush to put everything together. It was, I got kind of sick when I did that because I lost a lot of sleep at the end trying to meet a deadline, but it came out beautiful. I mean, sometimes I do my best work under stress, so, but it was a great achievement. So the fabric here, again, there's a big long space here, and there's a reason for that. There's a method to my madness. This is where you're going to cut out your bodice pieces. So if you're doing the UK version over here, you have one long piece you can use as a ruffle. You can use the other piece here for the ruffle, and then you can cut out all your bodice pieces, your sleeve pieces in the blank area. Okay, for the US version, much trickier. Now, again, you can't exactly get like the mitered corners and all that, but you can do like a separate little panel here. And let me zoom in to, if I had to do it this way, this is how I would do it, where you would have a 45-degree angle there, and you would have to pattern match, and it would be horrible, but you could do it. It would be possible to do it. You would need like your own little separate panel here, so you would have a seam there. But if you're doing it very clean, the seam might be hidden because it is a pretty, complicated costume. Zoom back out. Okay, so you're using little pieces there for the front. Okay, that's a lot of information on there. Again, these are not to scale, and they're not even as representative of the pieces as I'd like. I just did this from memory, but the pieces are very wild looking. they don't look like normal Victorian bodice pieces because they flare out at the bottom. So I'm going to come back to the slide, but I just want to show a real image of this. Okay, that one doesn't show it as well. That's the wrong costume. Okay, so, oh yes, in the US costume, there's also this detail I forgot about with these little, I don't know what those would be called, the little like godettes or little areas where you have like a triangle here and the fabric folds underneath. I'm not even going to get into that because that's crazy hard to do. But you can see the costume flares out. So if you just make a regular bodice, it's going to be constricted. Vents, Jen, is that what they're called? I'm not quite sure. They're complicated as hell is what they are. But if you look here, you can see how there's a bit of room for the skirt. So the skirt is so voluminous up here, you need to have more volume on that bottom tier, or else it's just going to be really constricted, and also it's not going to look proportionally right. So you can see just how wide the bottom of the bodice is right there. Pleats, I think that's what I was going to say, pleats. It's like a special kind of box pleat or some kind of crazy thing like that. It's beautiful, but you know what? If I had to do it again, I don't even know if I remembered how I did it. I hope I wrote notes down. Okay, we'll go back to that slide. So your pieces are very flared at the bottom. And if you're doing this version, you're going to need a lot more fabric than you think, because this is just showing you like maybe 1.5 yards. But again, nothing's to scale, nothing's pattern matched or anything. If you're doing it and you want it to look really, really good, you're going to need to sacrifice, a lot of fabric. You might not get the pieces this close. You might have to, cut them at weird angles and stuff. So if you're doing this version and if you're using this fabric, good luck. It's make a lot of mock-ups. If you're more of a beginner, I would highly, highly suggest the UK version over here, where, let me go back to both of them. The UK version where you're just putting a ruffle on the bottom there, which you could adjust later if you made a mistake, and not having the ruffles there. Just much easier. If you're an intermediate or advanced seamstress and you really want to do the USA version, it's possible. It's just very, very tricky. So, let me see my last slide here. Okay, so I mentioned that I had a lot of different sizes of fabrics. We've went through large, medium, small. I do have a tiny version, and I didn't necessarily make this version for the costume, but it could be used here if you want those scallops here to be really tiny in the bodice. The ones on the real USA version are quite tiny. I had originally made this print, this horizontal print for crafts and garments and fabrics. So if you were making a skirt or something like that, like a modern version of a skirt or home decor or anything, it was kind of more for crafts, but it can also be used for those areas. So let me zoom in to show that on the real costume. That's too blurry. Let me go to a different photo. So this would be the equivalent of like the small scallops down at the edge of the bodice, and then maybe the tiny ones here. You don't have to use them like that, but basically, if you can plan everything before you buy the fabric. Even if you plan it down to the T and you have everything perfect, you're still probably going to need about 10 to 15 various yards, depending on the version you're doing, depending on your size, your height, and all that. So, that's kind of tricky to plan that all out. But unless you have an unlimited budget, then just buy the fabric galore. So, I mean, just buy. I can give like general estimates of, you might need like 6 yards of the large, or, you can always order more, but it is pricey. It's, generally $20 to $30 a yard, but you can also wait for Spoonflower sales. They have 15% off sales sometimes. So that's good. And I'm going to put the link again in the chat if anyone's rewatching this later. Okay, so that's pretty much that. So also, Here again, if anyone missed it, was my first Aminta costume after a couple months of sewing. And then after about 8 or 9 years of sewing, although it might not take people that long. Let's zoom out. This is kind of version 2, kind of version 3, because again, I haven't ever finished version 2, which was based off of Anaya's costume there. So, that is the Aminta costume. It was the first one I ever dressed up in to go see a show. First time I ever like cosplayed in public with. And I put a slideshow on the side of the screen. So on the side of my screen, there's different products and stuff like that. So some of the stuff is just showing like portfolio stuff, but then I do offer items on my website that are all, related to this costume. I often call it Spanish scallops instead of Aminta. And I'll be adding more products too. I'm going to be adding like leggings and backpacks. But I have a couple of cool things up there like bags and the skirt and everything too. The skirt is super cute. I should have added a photo on my Instagram. There in the stories highlights there's a girl that ordered the Aminta skirt and it looks super cute on her. Let me add that in. Okay, I'm at Enchanted Sea, and you can see that picture there. But the best way to contact me if you have a question, especially about the Spoonflower fabric, try not to contact me through Spoonflower because you can't attach images. It's hard to talk through there. Just email me. So go to my website, which is www.enchantedseastudio.com, which I'm also putting in the chat. And you can find where to contact me there. But if we converse through email, then I get it right away and I can attach images and help you that way. I've also put this slideshow on my website, and I will have to link that later because I don't remember the exact link to that page. But I know I put it up on my social media, so you can check Facebook for that link right now. And the Facebook, you guessed it, is facebook.com/EnchantedSeaStudio. There should be a clickable link to this tutorial with all the slides that I put up there. So hopefully, I bet this will help a couple people. But thank you for tuning in. And if you liked me doing this with other costumes, you want me to do more, just let me know and give me a follow if you haven't already. Thanks.